He, white death, fell from the sky that Halloween evening, and we had made plans to walk the streets gathering sweets. But the frozen storm kept most families locked inside their warm homes, and when the hour arrived, only three of us stepped into the bitter cold, myself and two others, named Ethan and Connor. We covered ourselves in thick winter gear, heavy boots, coats, scarves, and gloves, until nothing showed except the masks hiding our faces. We began our march through the buried streets, and for the first 2 hours, other children wandered the whiteness like phantoms. But as the light bled from the sky, only we three remained. Moving through the mounting drifts, we continued our path from door to door, our bags slowly filling until we arrived at a house sitting on the block corner. Nothing seemed strange about it. We approached and knocked on the entrance, and an old woman handed us candy through her cracked door. But as we turned to leave her porch, a towering shadow stood perfectly still on the driveway. He wore a thick, dark coat, and over his face hung a mask that made my insides twist. It looked disturbingly real, with long, wet black hair falling down past his shoulders, like something pulled from a nightmare. Connor whispered, he knew that face from the cursed internet pictures that spread years ago when that horrible image haunted screens everywhere. And now, here it stood before us in flesh and bone, standing in the falling snow, staring at us. The shadow made no movement toward the house or away from it. He simply remained there in the gathering white, his hidden eyes fixed on us. We continued along the sidewalk, looking back several times, but the blizzard consumed him into its pale throat. What made our fear grow was knowing this was no child, but a fully grown man, tall and alone in the storm, with no reason. We could see Ethan convinced us to skip the next few houses, and we crossed to another street, trying to escape the crawling dread. But the whiteout prevented us from seeing beyond one or two homes ahead, and we had no way of knowing if he still lingered out there. 30 minutes dragged by, and the sun disappeared completely. Even the streetlights barely penetrated the heavy snowfall. Ethan said his family wanted him home before total darkness, so Connor and I walked him to his house and then discussed what to do. With only the two of us by that point, we had almost forgotten the masked shadow. He had done nothing harmful, and we never saw him trailing us, so we let it slip from our thoughts. Connor and I visited a few more doors, collecting more candy, until the cold became too painful and we were no longer having fun at all. So Connor separated toward his own home, leaving me to walk to my house alone. And the walk would take 15 minutes, maybe longer in the deep snow. The instant I was by myself, everything changed. It no longer felt like Halloween, just emptiness and white silence burying every inch of the streets, and I was completely alone. Once that truth settled into my bones, I started glancing around, desperately hoping to see another group of children. But instead, my eyes found something else across the road. From where I walked stretched a thick wall of forest, and through the dark trunks, a figure stood watching me. At first, I only saw the shape standing far back, mostly hidden by shadow and falling snow. But as I kept walking, the figure moved with me, matching my pace step for step, keeping me in sight. My heart began pounding against my ribs, and I walked faster, eventually reaching a turn where I could move deeper into the neighborhood, toward more houses and away from the trees. But the figure followed, stepping out from the tree line, and when he passed beneath a street lamp, I saw it clearly. That same horrible mask, with the long black hair hanging wet over his shoulders. He must have tracked us the entire night, waiting patiently for one of us to be separated and alone. I broke into a run, moving as fast as my legs could carry me through the empty, silent streets, feeling like I was fleeing through some abandoned, dead world. When I reached my house, I locked the door behind me, but for reasons I still cannot understand, I did not tell my family what happened. I just went straight to my room and sat on the edge of my bed, trying to catch my breath, trying to convince myself it was not real, that if I did not speak it aloud, it would not be true. Several minutes passed, and then the doorbell rang and ice water flooded through my veins. Because I had seen no one else outside while running home, I heard my family talking, confused that anyone would still be out collecting candy this late. My mother retrieved the bowl of sweets they had already stored away and opened the front door, and I crept quietly into the hallway and looked down toward the entrance, and my stomach fell through the floor. It was the tall man still wearing that dead mask, and though I could not see his eyes, I knew he was staring directly at me. Standing there at the end of the hall, he did not take any candy. He did not speak to my mother. He simply turned and walked back into the storm. Most likely he had hoped I would be home alone. My mother said it was creepy and bizarre knowing it was an adult, but she dismissed it as a tasteless Halloween joke, and I never told her the truth about what that man was really hunting for that night. My name is Marcus, and at the time this happened, I was 29. The season of autumn had settled in, and the trees were releasing their dying leaves when I drove north to a small rental cabin I had visited several times before it rested deep in the forest with a black lake pressed against its back wall, and it felt like a second home to me, a place to disappear when life became too heavy. The first day I arrived, I removed my belongings and spent the afternoon settling into the silence, then walked down to the lake to watch the sun sink below the tree line. While standing there, I noticed someone moving along the shore in the distance, walking the edge of the water slowly. It did not appear threatening, so I barely acknowledged it, just noted it and moved on. After the sun died completely, darkness swallowed everything, so I went back inside and locked the entrance. There was not much to do in the cabin except sit and think, so I sat on the old couch and let my mind drift until I felt tired enough for sleep. I turned off all the lights, verified the locks once more, and climbed into bed, and was just beginning to fade away when a voice called out from outside asking if anyone was inside, asking hello, asking to be acknowledged. Someone was at the back door knocking and calling for me. I was confused and deeply disturbed, so I stayed silent. And after a few minutes, the voice faded and the knocking stopped. I waited, then rose and looked outside but saw nothing. In the thick darkness, I could not understand how anyone could even move out there in that blackness. It unsettled me. But I closed all the curtains and returned to bed, and the rest of the night passed without incident. Morning came, and I made coffee and tried to forget about it. The day unfolded much the same as the one before, though a few times the memory of that voice returned to me, but I had no answers. So I pushed it aside. That evening, I stayed outside longer, having built a small fire so I could see into the darkness around me. I sat there for about an hour when I heard movement in the trees behind me. I turned and peered into the black, but could see almost nothing. I dismissed it as an animal until it happened again, and when I looked back, a heavy dread settled over me like a wet blanket soaked in fear. I quickly smothered the fire and hurried inside, taking one last look at the woods before locking the door behind me. I could feel something building, something wrong, and I was right, because less than 10 minutes later, someone knocked on the back door again, and the same voice called out, asking if I was inside, asking me to open up. The voice was identical to the one from the night before. I stood frozen in the narrow hallway, and as the knocking continued, I slowly leaned around the corner to look at the door, and his eyes were already staring directly at me through the glass, wild and bloodshot, with that look of complete insanity. He looked filthy and desperate, and he began begging me to open the door, pleading with me to let him inside. But beneath his words, I could hear anger bubbling, like something ready to explode. I pulled back and ran to the bedroom and called 911 for help, and almost immediately he started pounding on the bedroom window harder and harder until I heard the glass cracks splitting under his fists, and then suddenly everything went silent. I heard nothing more, and when the police arrived minutes later, he was gone, but blood streaked the cracked window, smeared where he had beaten the glass with his bare hands until they bled. The thought of how unhinged he must have been to do that still makes my skin crawl with terror. I never returned to that cabin after that night, and no one ever discovered who he was or what he wanted from me. Where I live around Halloween, it always gets pretty cold. Sometimes snow falls early, sometimes it holds off, but the chill is always there this year. Snow came down heavy through the night, and by the time evening arrived, it was falling again in thick curtains. So most families stayed indoors. I sat inside by the fireplace, handing out candy to the few children who braved the cold, all of them buried under thick coats and scarves that hid their costumes completely. As the hours passed, the snow intensified, and even the stubborn ones gave up and went home. 30 minutes went by without a single knock, and the sun had already set, so I assumed the night was over. I stood up from the couch and started toward the door to lock it, but stopped cold because it was already open. Swinging gently in the freezing wind that poured into the house, I walked over and looked outside but saw no one and pulled it shut. I stood there trying to rationalize it, telling myself I must have failed to close it properly when the last group of children came by. I had not locked it because I was opening it constantly anyway. I convinced myself it was nothing and returned to the couch, though I did pull back the curtains to watch the snow continue to fall. Outside, hours crept by, and the temperature dropped further, and the storm grew more violent. I checked the weather several times to make sure we were not in the path of something dangerous. Around 10, I felt tired enough for bed, so I shut off the television and went to the kitchen to wash the dishes from dinner. It was part of my routine, cleaning before sleep, but as I stood there putting things away, I heard a long creaking sound directly above me. Like a door slowly opening on old hinges, I froze and stared up at the ceiling, listening as the sound faded into silence. For a moment, I stood there in disbelief because it sounded exactly like something from a horror film, too perfect to be real. I finished cleaning and turned off all the lights downstairs and climbed the stairs to check on the sound, though honestly, I did not expect to find anything. But when I entered my bedroom, I saw it immediately. The closet door was standing wide open, and my blood turned to ice. I connected it instantly to the front door that had also been mysteriously open, and my mind began racing. This could not be coincidence. I looked into the closet but saw nothing inside. I searched the room but found no other signs that anyone had been there, and somehow that made it worse because if someone had entered, where were they? And why sneak in just to open doors? I felt sick with fear. So I locked my bedroom door and paced back and forth, trying to think clearly. And then I glanced toward the door and saw it, a dark shadow beneath the gap, 2 feet standing just outside. Listening, I held completely still, barely breathing. Even though whoever was out there obviously knew I was inside, I just did not want them to know that I knew. I stood there frozen, staring at that shadow for what felt like an eternity. 2 or 3 minutes at least. I wanted to call for help, but was terrified they would hear me, which left me paralyzed with indecision. I think my prolonged silence finally gave me away because the doorknob began to turn slowly, testing the lock, clicking softly against the mechanism, and then the shadow shifted and moved away from the door. Perhaps they realized I could see their feet beneath the gap. I do not know. But after that, I heard nothing at all. I waited 10 more minutes, straining to detect any sound, any sign. They were still there or still in my house. Eventually, I had to call the authorities, though I whispered when I spoke. When the officers arrived and searched, they found no one. But I knew what had been standing outside my door, and I knew what would have happened if I had not locked it just moments earlier. This happened not too long ago, when I was 26. Halloween had stopped meaning anything to me years earlier. It was just another day. This year, I had the day off but worked the overnight shift from 10 until 6 in the morning. I stocked shelves at a grocery store. So most nights were quiet, just me working alone at my own pace. By the time I left my house, the streets were already deserted. No children, no decorations, just empty pavement. When I arrived and parked and walked to the store to unlock the entrance, I noticed several people around the side of the building wearing costumes. I did not think much of it. Maybe they were meeting up for something. I unlocked the door and stepped inside and locked it behind me and began my shift, moving between the warehouse and the aisles, stocking and organizing. It was not long before I thought I heard voices outside, so I walked to the front and saw the same group near the windows. It looked like they were just wandering around for context. The store sat alone in a massive empty lot with a few other buildings nearby, but all vacant, so there was no reason to be in this lot unless you were coming to the store, which was obviously closed. I stayed near the front, watching them. They passed out of view for 10 minutes, then circled back around their costumes, made it impossible to tell if they were looking in through the glass or just standing near it. But either way, it was bizarre that they were lingering for so long with no clear purpose. Eventually, I had to get back to work, so I left the front and continued stocking the shelves with one earbud and listening to music. An hour passed, and I was deep in one of the aisles, far from the entrance, when I heard three loud bangs on the glass. It startled me, but I ran to the front to see what was happening. The four figures in costumes stood clustered together facing the window. I was behind, staring directly at me. I stepped closer and shouted through the glass, asking what they needed. And as I stood there, I realized none of them carried bags or pillowcases for candy, which would have been odd anyway at this hour and at a closed store, but at least it would have suggested they had been trick or treating earlier now. It seemed they were only wearing costumes to hide their identities. Not a single face was visible, and none of them answered me. They just stood there staring. I felt deeply uncomfortable, but tried to convince myself it was just some Halloween prank not worth my time. So I turned and went back to the aisle I had been working in. I still felt uneasy, but clung to the idea that they were just messing with me. Maybe they saw me enter earlier and thought it would be amusing, but it escalated far beyond a joke. Less than 2 minutes later, a massive crash hit the glass at the front, and before I could even reach the end of the aisle to look, a second even louder impact struck. And then I heard the unmistakable sound of the door shattering open. I froze, hearing multiple footsteps rushing inside. I spun and sprinted toward the back of the store. I was so terrified I did not even grab my bag with my keys and wallet. I just ran straight out the back exit onto the road and kept running. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, I called for help. By the time officers arrived, everyone was gone. We had security footage that showed exactly what happened, but it revealed nothing I did not already know. The group had lingered outside for hours, then smashed through the door and immediately began searching for me, which was the most disturbing part. They looked everywhere. One of them even reached the back of the store just 15 seconds after I escaped through the rear exit. If he had seen me, the entire group might have chased me down, and things might have ended very differently. That was where it ended what they actually wanted, and all the questions I still have remain unanswered to this day.